Data protection and privacy teams are under more pressure than ever with new laws, AI oversight, data breaches, and the constant expectation to do more with fewer resources.
That's why TrustArc built a modern privacy and data protection management platform powered by Arc Intelligence. It unifies your tools, automates the work that slows you down, and surfaces what matters most right when you need it.
From guided quick actions to our intelligent assistant, Ask Arc, you get credible, contextual answers backed by expert research, not generic AI guesses.
Finally, privacy that works the way privacy pros work.
Learn how TrustArc helps teams move faster with confidence at trustarc.com/serious-privacy. That's trustarc.com/serious-privacy.
You're listening to Serious Privacy by TrustArc. Please welcome our hosts, Paul Breitbarth and Kay Royal.
The 25th of May 2018 will be a day that is forever etched into my memory. It is a day I had been working towards for well over 7 years by the time it arrived, and with me thousands and thousands of others. For those of you who don't remember, it is the day the GDPR entered into application this week 2 years ago. And what other topic could we therefore discuss in today's Serious Privacy episode than the first official GDPR review that should have been out this week? Which are the lessons learned after 2 years of working with the GDPR and 2 years of enforcing the GDPR? You will get both the US and the European perspective, and we have a very special guest joining our conversation. My name is Paul Breitbarth.
And I'm Kay Royal, and welcome to Serious Privacy. Today, I have the distinct pleasure of bringing a very special guest to you, the man that is responsible for the podcast, responsible for Paul and myself being at TrustArc, responsible for basically everything great in the world, and that is our CEO, Chris Babel. And I can't tell you how delighted I am to be able to have him on a podcast and shoot all kinds of unexpected questions at him since we're an unscripted conversation. But we all know that the first question is going to be an unexpected personal question. So, Chris, I have a good one for you this morning.
I can hardly wait, Kay.
We all hear the phrase out of the mouths of babes. What is one piece of wisdom you have learned from a child?
One piece of wisdom that I've learned for a child. I think the most interesting thing, and I have 3 kids that are no longer kind of that same child. They're more teenagers. So you lose it a little bit. You lose it a little bit when they get that old. But what's cool about kids is just kind of their unbridled optimism and wow with like things that they see that are very ordinary in the world. You know, like I'll never forget my middle son. He'd seen snow a bunch of times on the ground, but the first time he saw it coming out of the air, he was just dumbfounded. Like, what is that? And to see little kids like put together things that are kind of ordinary, that as we get older, we just, you know, it's just, you don't even think about it. But to see that light bulb go off for the first time, that's, I think, incredibly cool about little kids.
That is awesome. Paul, what about you? Wisdom from a child?
For me, it's hard. I have no children, and I have only a few friends with children so far that I don't see too often. So I don't speak with children quite a lot, to be honest.
What was your wisdom as a child then? Anything you remember?
I don't know. I probably was a smartass, but I don't recall any wisdoms.
Well, I will say that I was going to, when my daughter was 3, she was sitting in the back seat of my car. We were leaving, I don't know, a dance practice or something, and it turned out the headlights on my car didn't work. And I talk to myself. I'm sure that surprises both of you. But I also answer myself. So the lights didn't work, but it turned out bright did. And I went, well, there we go. The lights don't work, but the brights work. So, and as we were driving, a person, of course, flashed their bright lights at me. And I'm like, sorry, dude, I got no choice. It's bright lights or nothing. And out of the back seat, my 3-year-old goes, I said, I have no choice. My daughter goes, you do have a choice, Mama. You always have a choice. You just might not like the top. And I was like,
that's pretty clever.
Yeah, there was the whole looking over my shoulder going, oh my goodness gracious, this is going to be a trip. All right, with that, we will dive straight into the GDPR because when this podcast launches, it will be the day after GDPR turns officially 2 years old. And it has been a wild 2 years, absolutely.
Yes, Kate, it has been wild indeed. You are perfectly right there. Before we look at the past 2 years of how GDPR applied, Let me just bring you back to the moment that the European Commission announced the GDPR. What were the original intentions of the European Commission with this new set of legislation? And I've got two clips from the press conference of Commissioner Viviane Reding, who at the time was the responsible commissioner for justice and also for the data protection portfolio. She starts with the explanation of what the GDPR exactly intends to do and why it is so important.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have done it. Today, the European Commission adopted a comprehensive reform on the EU's data protection rule. With this reform, the European Union will create a real single digital market, accessible both for companies and for consumers. It will make Europe more competitive in this field, and it will make Europe an international standard setter in terms of modern data protection rules.
Next, she explains the main pillars of the new legislation.
A single set of European rules on data protection, valid everywhere across the European Union. So one rule for the 27 member states and for the 500 million people. One data protection authority for one company, a one-stop shop, and one authorization for the whole of the European Union.
This was January 2012, so well over 8 years ago. And now let's take it to the conversation with Chris. Kay, why don't you kick us off?
On it. Let's do it. So, Chris.
We would like to explore your expectations when you first heard of the GDPR being proposed. Now, you might have had some behind-the-scenes knowledge of working with privacy, but when the GDPR was first proposed, do you recall what your first thoughts were about it? Like, oh, wow, this is going to change the world, or oh, no, here we go again? Anything?
The most interesting things when I was thinking back to it was the thing I remember kind of being surprised about with GDPR, like the first big aha moment was the realization that no one understood it. And so at TrustArc, back then, I think we hadn't changed the name, Trustee, we were running a few privacy conferences that were focused on specific issues that we didn't think people were addressing. So I think the first one was 2014 and 15 on IoT, and in 2016 was on risk. Then we did those in the summer. But EU Safe Harbor had gone away in October of 15. And we had planned already in advance, because GDPR had just been ratified, an event that was, I think, early December of 15, if I recall correctly, in San Francisco. And I remember...
Yeah, that's more or less right.
I remember the lead up to that, and having like reporters even want to come and people coming to want to speak. And I think we didn't say it was GDPR specific, but it was in all its content. But we talked about EU privacy was the headline, and everybody came, and the only thing they wanted to talk about was Safe Harbor going away, and was the new thing going to happen. And we put together this event and this content and these speakers and wrapped it all together in, I think, a very compelling way. But people just weren't focused on it at all. All they wanted to talk about was Safe Harbor going away. And when you looked at the two at the time, it was like, this is a small thing, Safe Harbor. I mean, it's important that it went away, and we have to figure out what's next. And of course, that turned into Privacy Shield, and you still had contractual clauses, and you still had binding corporate rules. But like, that was the big topic on European privacy. And when you look back at that with hindsight, and you kind of weigh those two and see what's happened the last 5 years, it's just shocking that we couldn't even talk about GDPR in the way that we'd wanted to, because it wasn't on anyone's mind. The realization of what was going to come wasn't there. I think people probably, Paul, like you, that had worked on it for years before that, recognized it. But even amongst Europeans, I don't think there was the recognition of the balance of how important these two were. So that was my first big aha moment, if you will.
No, not at all. I think in Europe, while all of us working behind the scenes on getting the GDPR done, whether there were the people from the European Commission or from the Council of Ministers or in the European Parliament, or all the lobbyists pro or against more stringent rules in the GDPR, I think all of us after 4 years were pretty fed up with the GDPR as it was. And we just wanted to get it over with and just agree on the text, let's get it done and start working with it, because we've been talking about what it should be for so many years. There were over 3,000 amendments during the legislative process in the European Parliament, plus another 1,000 for the law enforcement directive. We had worked through all of them. We had worked through, I don't know how many sessions of the Working Party 29, providing guidance and further guidance and more detailed guidance to the European the European Commission on what we thought that the GDPR should look like, spoken in countless sessions, public, in private, with the European Parliament. And we just wanted to make sure that it was all over. And this was not all me. I mean, I only played a very minor role. My colleagues at the Dutch DPA did a lot more on the GDPR than I did. But it was fascinating to live through those times. And especially if you now see that some of the things that came up during brainstorms with data protection commissioners in a horrible convention center in Brussels during one of those Working Party 29 meetings, that you see that some of those sentences are now part of the GDPR. That's still fun.
Oh, that is awesome. Is making law behind the scenes a lot like it is in the U.S. too? Is it pretty much the same everywhere? It's ugly. You don't want to see it.
Well, I never did a U.S. legislative process.
It's
at
ugly.
least not with Congress. I did attend some of the sessions on the Privacy Shield at the time, and also that was pretty ugly. Yes, you don't want to know how laws are made, and you don't always want to question why is a text like this and why is a certain decision taken like that. It is obvious that there are compromises in the GDPR and that some text should have been different. There are also still errors in the GDPR that should be changed at some point in the future. For one, I don't understand why Article 30 on the records of processing inventory, one of the most important accountability issues, why it doesn't include the legal basis for processing, whereas Articles 13 and 14 on the information you need to provide to the data subject does include the legal basis. They should be a mirror of each other, and they're not. And I think that's just an oversight. But
They should be. Chris, what do you think is the most impactful article of the GDPR? And you may not be able to narrow it down to one, but which one do you think really has an impact?
1 through 50.
You know, we have a client that has every single article memorized.
That's not me.
Right? And apparently that's what he likes to do when he's talking to a privacy person, is to test their knowledge. And so he'll arbitrarily throw out article numbers to see if you know them. I can't memorize the articles, so I told him one time the one that really got me was 102. I really couldn't see why Article 102 was in place. He went and looked it up.
there is no 102.
The thing that I think was most interesting for me about the GDPR, because I've been in the security industry for 10 years, right? And I got to see the security industry grow up, and I got to see it grow up from where you were realizing that hacking might be a problem, and you saw the first security devices, like literally the first firewall sold in the mid 90s, all the way through to all this barrage of security technology that then needed to kind of be pulled together to really manage a good security program. And while we'll never fully be there, I got to see that process evolve. And, the reason I jumped really the end of 2009, beginning of 2010 over to the privacy side of things is that I saw a lot of the similar needs in privacy, where security was a lot of, thinking about locking down and securing the data. Privacy is a lot more of like, how can I use this data? How can I manipulate the data? How can I share the data to further my business while providing good experiences and doing it in kind of a trusted, safe way? So a lot of the same themes. And when I made that jump over, I thought that we were going to be at the start of kind of the adoption of technology. And candidly, I was wrong. It was too early. You saw adoption of things like the ad choices icon in the US and Europe to deal with behaviorally targeted ads. You saw the beginning of cookie consent and kind of scanning to see what cookies were running and things like that. But this GDPR question of what's the most important, part of it, I actually think the whole thing is, because what it really caused was a fundamental shift in thinking about how important this is to get right. And that there was going to kind of come with this an enhanced level, not just of the regulatory scrutiny, which certainly has happened and you've seen fines, and I'm certain we'll talk about some of those. And a lot of people didn't think the Europeans were ever going to fine. They've never fined before. They don't fine much. It's not going to happen, is what I heard a lot. And clearly that's been proven wrong. But I think more importantly was that it changed kind of the mindset. I mean, I when I talk to companies today, sure, they're worried about regulatory scrutiny and maybe a fine potential, but they're more worried about the bad press of something that happens and brand damage that comes with an inquiry. Or they're more worried about kind of, their B2B interactions with other companies and kind of this mutual holding each other accountable to get this right on behalf of, eventual end consumers, right? And so there's almost a bigger pressure on the GDPR in this peer group type way amongst businesses that I think has been interesting because, and last but not least, obviously, consumers had new rights and abilities to understand their data, and it kind of got them more engaged in owning their own privacy. And certainly I think that is transferred over to other laws like the CCPA in California and, a whole host of them that were at least being debated in the US and now a little bit on hold with COVID, but I think we'll come back. And so when I think about it, I don't think about a specific requirement that caused the most. I think the GDPR in total caused a different set of thinking, both, again, regulatory wise, peer group wise, how you interact with consumers, consumer engagement and owning their own privacy and their own data. That's really what has kind of come out of this and then pushed to other countries or states to follow bits and pieces that were, relevant to that jurisdiction. So I think that's actually the most important thing of the GDPR is because it caused a mindset shift really kind of on a, global scale.
I like it.
Do you think that also the company's risk appetite or risk approach has changed with GDPR coming into effect?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I think, that's still really evolving. I mean, there are still companies that are woefully under-ready for GDPR, and that's probably a horrific thing to state.
But
we see them all every day.
All the listeners 2 years later, but if you're just getting started in listening to this on your GDPR program, you're happy that I'm telling you this. You're not alone. There's still a whole host of companies that really haven't started on any of these things. And it's not because they were formed yesterday. It's because that's just the priorities and how they've gotten to them. And I guess I would say that isn't surprising. I mean, let's look at either other privacy laws. HIPAA in the US took 10 to 15 years for a lot of companies to get there and be enforced and drive the clarity that really got people operating at kind of their programs to meet it in a structured, robust, automated, reliable way, right? And, back when I was in my security days, I got to live through a whole host of the implications to security from Sarbanes-Oxley. And it took years to get that right, to get it defined right, Paul, to your point of like, wow, look, even in the law and in all the interpretations, here's all these things that still are inconsistent, right? I mean, it's 2 years later and we're not through all those. And that's okay. It's evolving. And also, I think there's going to be things that come up that cause it to evolve going forward. Like, I think if you look at the COVID-19 health implications, right? Of, yes, the fact that I took a test and tested positive, I want to keep private. That's my data, but gosh, everyone that you work next to really wants to know. And so how you balance the things of individual privacy versus like more global health issues is going to cause people to rethink a whole host of these things. And there will be future things that come up that cause thinking to change on a lot of these items as well. But yeah, to me, I think it was the first big stake in the ground that caused a mindset shift. And that's probably one of the biggest legacies of GDPR.
I think, and I love the conversation. There's so much you said that resonates, but I love the conversation about how it's going to evolve. And one thing that really stands out to me, and Paul and I have discussed this on some of our podcasts before, is how the GDPR will evolve versus how U.S. law will evolve, such as the CCPA. The ink wasn't even dry on the paper and the hash marks before it was already being amended and constantly amended and 4 amendments. And now we have a ballot initiative coming up. It will never be settled, it doesn't seem. But yet the GDPR, it seems like the way it's evolving is through guidance. You're not seeing a lot of let's take it back and amend it. Is there a fallacy in that, or is there a reassurance in that European law will remain European law?
Yeah, and Paul, you're probably best suited amongst us, but I'll throw in a few high-level points. I mean, I think it's a tough comparison to compare it to CCPA because like the California law, and I'm certain people know this, but not everyone may, is, we have some very goofy things in California where there's this ballot initiative process where if it gets on the ballot through people kind of signing and saying they support this ballot initiative and then gets voted on by the people and gets approved, then the only way that it can change is either A, through another ballot initiative, which are very hard and expensive to do, or B, through a 2/3 majority of the legislature. And that 2/3 bar makes it very hard for any ballot initiative to be changed. And so Alistair McTaggart had done the ballot initiative. He'd gotten it through. It was going to be on the ballot. It was going to pass. And in a pretty hurried way, that law was passed to take it off the ballot, right? And so that law was put in place intentionally in a hurried way with a plan for it to be amended many times. And I think, from what Paul said earlier,
the plan worked.
Yeah. And, but comparing that to GDPR, where, Paul and many, many, many others spent 4+ years, really working hard to get it as right as you could the first time. The reality of the CCPA was it was put together in a matter of months to meet a deadline of taking that ballot initiative off. And, if you're following it, even then, McTaggart has been a bit concerned about some of the things that have been changed and that they are not as strong. And yeah, we're going to have another ballot initiative here in California at the November election. So
yeah, and if he's listening, we want him on our show. Throwing it out there yet again, we want him on our show.
He's an incredible person to talk to and understand the history behind everything that he's done. But so I think they're fundamentally different in how they came into being, right? And I think that's an important element to know and the differences. But I think in either case, what you're seeing, regardless of the structure of how it's happening, you're seeing the evolution to meet an ongoing need and trying to drive that balance between kind of the things that businesses want to drive forward their growth and provide better customer, consumer or business to business experiences, and kind of consumers coming and saying, my line's more over here rather than over there, and kind of the pushback through consortiums to arm wrestle those things to the ground. So whether it's through additional guidance, the GDPR more model in terms of updates, or whether it's amendments and to the law, which you'll see more of because they're candidly required by the initial bill. We still don't have what the law should be for employee data or B2B data, right? And it was supposed to be done a long time ago, and they amended it to say we have till the end of 2020. And I think if you look at what's happening with COVID and the fact that we want our legislators focused on different things right now, candidly, that are bigger issues, that will probably be a bit delayed. And that's okay, but they're just different methodologies to get at the same point, which is all these laws need to evolve with the times.
Right.
Yes, I fully agree with that. And indeed, the processes are quite different, because in California, you are obviously just dealing with the California legislature, which would be comparable to one national member state parliament instead of the European Commission, the Council of Ministers, and all their civil servants. The European Parliament, some 40+ national parliaments that also want to have their say, if you count both the lower and the upper houses of the national parliaments, that all are involved in that legislative process. And then the massive amount of lobbyists and interest groups around it, whether that is corporate interests. We've seen lots of lobbying from the likes of Google and Apple and Microsoft and Facebook and all the big companies, big tech companies that you can think of, both from the US but also from here in Europe. And then, of course, we had all the civil society groups who are pro-stricter privacy protections, who also found their way to the Parliament and to the Commission and the Council for further lobbying. We had the data protection authorities, which obviously wanted to get involved. And we had foreign governments. The US government impacted the text of the GDPR quite a lot. If you look back to early December, late November 2011, a draft of the GDPR leaked online. And that was a deliberate leak. This is strategy from the European Commission. It will never be admitted, but we all know that this was deliberately leaked to give a sense of what GDPR would look like. And if you compare that version from late 2011 with the final version that was adopted on 25 January 2012, when the European Commission released their proposals, you see that some of the more harmful provisions in the GDPR, at least from a US perspective, that they are gone. And it was admitted also later that was a US lobby which changed the provisions of the GDPR before it was even officially released. So you can see what the impact of the legislative process is. I do not expect GDPR to change anytime soon. If you look at the review documents from the European Council and also from the European Data Protection Board, it is clear that there are shortcomings and that there are things that need to be improved. But also both say, well, we don't think this is the right time already to start opening up GDPR again. It's a can of worms if we start to do that. Let's take a few more years, let's get more experience, and then do a review which is thorough and good based on real experience instead of just 2 years, and focus the legislative attention first on finalizing e-privacy, because we haven't succeeded to do that yet. And that was supposed to also enter into application at the same time as GDPR.
Agreed. Was there anything, I know you said GDPR put a stake in the ground, Chris, and I want to move on to how do you think that's influenced laws around the world, because we know it has. Was there anything unexpected in the GDPR that when you saw it, you were like, really? Why that?
Well, I would just say, both from kind of my personal reaction in first looking at it, as well as like the endless conversations with customers, prospects, the thing that kept going back again and again and again was just the fine potential. Right. And you could get into all sorts of details of, wow, I was surprised that, I can, have a dog and not a cat, to make up some, and there's all sorts of things like that in there that people were surprised by this or that. And wow, this affects my industry in this way. And I want to, figure out how to lobby for it or whatever. But the thing that just kept elevating back was, wow, the potential for a fine was just so shockingly large. And yes, it went down 1% from the initial conversation, but it is still so shockingly large that I think that's still the headline that got repeated again and again for good reason, right? And I think that there were a couple parts to that I thought were interesting. One is, some of the enforcements that you see are fine related, but others are actually sometimes less talked about, where companies are being asked to either delete data or, exit kind of operations in the way that they're doing things if they don't have kind of the right reason for having the data or using the data for that purpose. And candidly, those are the things that are more catastrophic to a business. It's like, stop operations here or delete your data set if you're in the advertising space, right? I mean, like, that's your lifeblood. And I think what's talked about still so often is like, oh, it was a fine of X dollars or Y dollars. And it's really not just those that need to be talked about. It's the implications for your business, because being asked to stop is more impactful. Stop in Europe.
Yeah,
wow.
You can't do business in this country anymore, in this region anymore. That's pretty impactful. And I will say, and this goes back to something you said earlier, when leading up to the GDPR, and I think some of the surveys we did actually showed this as well. And when I saw the survey outcomes, I was like, that's true. That's what I've seen. Or, yeah, that makes sense. Was that up until the GDPR went effective, it was people were talking fines. CFOs were always, isn't this going to go away? Once the GDPR went effective, it's almost like we saw it flip, and company was like, oh, reputation. I need to make sure my clients trust me. I need to make sure consumers trust me. I need to make sure we're doing the right thing. The fine part is still there because Europe is fining, and of course the other implications it has. But it was interesting how we saw that flip from, it seems like the fines were the boogeyman in the attic that people were scared of, and then it flipped to, you know what, we really need to do the right thing. Do you think the GDPR seriously contributed to a culture shift in how companies treat data and think about it?
Well, I guess to me, there's two parts of kind of maybe that. The first part is when a law like this gets on the books and companies need to do something, right? Both figure out what it is, what it means, how to apply it to their business, how to achieve the objectives that are out there, and then do it in a sustainable, recurring type way. That all takes money and budgets. And so I think a lot of what you heard about initially from the fine perspective conversation was candidly a part of businesses trying to figure out how to fund this stuff internally, right? And the easiest way to do that is to point to concrete risks. So, X amount of business times 4% equals this. This is the fine potential. Therefore, the fact that I'm asking for a budget that's 1% of that number is teeny. And this was, it shouldn't have been unexpected.
And yet still not getting it in most cases.
But any of these things, and I'll rewind back to my early days of security, right? Like, it was impossible to get a budget for that first firewall, because when they first realized that you needed one, or, network security scanning or application scanning or endpoint security and all these things, like, when you're starting in a space like that, the money historically had been spent on hiring either, legal advice or consulting advice. It had not been spent on implementing or thinking through a technology that you deploy and grow over time to manage the requirements, both in GDPR as you get further into them or other laws globally, and how it works to kind of mesh these laws globally so that you have the ability to do an effort once and have it meet multiple requirements, right? And kind of that new first spend in anything in IT is hard. And the easiest way to justify that is to say, again, here's the fine potential, and therefore that's an ultimate high-end risk number we have. And then, you prorate some spend according to what you think that risk is applied to you. And that's how kind of IT decisions are made. And so I think that's why you saw a lot of that conversation. I think the reputation one was a bit harder because it was very easy to say, well, to challenge the assumptions, right? And you go back and you look, and the closest equivalent would be looking at some of the big security data breaches that you've had and hearing companies say like, well, we had this big breach. I think, I heard once that the Target CEO basically said it took me years to get back the trust post that breach, right, of kind of consumers. But that's hard to put a number on. So I think the first wave of conversation was really both the internal conversation of trying to get budget spilling over into the public debate in Discord. And then the second part of this is the realization that it's really both. Both of those are risks for you. And depending on who you are and what happens and, what action you took that caused the issue to come back to you, it could be solely about reputation, and that could be the most damaging. It could be that the fine's the most damaging. But I think that's why you saw that sort of transition a little bit over time, is because then once you start getting the budget, it's easier to say, well, incrementally, we need to do this, this, and this. But it's that starting budget for that initial hump of work to say, what the heck is this thing and how do I start? That's the hard part to go get funded internally inside a business.
I think the one example that we have where you can really put a number on reputation and the value of or the cost of a data breach for reputation is the Verizon takeover of Yahoo, where the original number was, I believe, well over $1 billion. And the final number that Verizon paid was several hundreds of millions of dollars lower when Yahoo had to come clean that, in fact, they had a data breach. And in a second round, yes, it was not just a part of our customers, it was all of our customers who were involved in the data breach. And you saw the number go down with every further report on that data breach being released. And that was not specifically GDPR related, but you see how impactful bad publicity can be following a breach.
Yeah, when you were talking about companies that had to think about doing privacy or security, and way back when their first costs were in getting legal advice or getting consulting advice to what is it you need to do, TrustArc was a big part of that. And we usually don't talk a lot about our products in here, so I'm not going that direction. But we were a large part of working with companies to figure out what it is they need to do. And part of that was because we've been in the privacy industry since there was such a thing as a privacy industry, maybe not 50 years ago, but a long time. Do you think that experience in privacy really helps us be able to absorb and relate more to GDPR than we're seeing new professionals come into the field that are learning privacy straight out of university? Such as I've got law students in privacy class now. They're going to graduate knowing more about privacy than I ever knew 20 years ago.
I think that's what's really interesting, whether it was how the security industry evolved. Like the first CISOs learned on the job. Right. And now you can have security IT classes in a whole host of different ways, online, offline, in university, what have you. And the same thing's happening with privacy. If you would have rewound, 10 years ago, right, how many law schools had classes on privacy? And now you can come out of certain law schools and like privacy is a focus that you have spent many, many classes on, not just hey, here's a class that covers 4 different things and privacy is one of them, right? And I think as the profession has taken off and the needs have taken off and the kind of blending of privacy issues with ethical decision-making and like all sorts of, other data governance, what have you, is all coming together to be something that people are focused on. Now, some of us that have been around and at it for a long time, we've learned on the job without kind of the university training. And others coming out now, like, man, they can hit the ground running in a way with a set of knowledge that we certainly didn't have when we started, which is fantastic. But I think in all things, it's interesting to see the blend of those, because sometimes with experience, you've seen and tried and done things that seem great on paper, but work horrifically operationally, and you have that experience. The flip is also true that with a fresh mindset where you haven't seen something and failed at it, you sometimes have a lot more creativity because you don't have the baggage of experience. And that's what's, I think,
a good blend.
It's, whether it's this industry, whether it was security before that I dealt with, whether it's hundreds of different industries, that consistent blend of, even in engineering, like the amount of education you can get to become an engineer in college and master's and PhD studies is unbelievable compared to computer science, 40 years ago, which didn't really exist in university, right?
Right.
But kind of how these things balance to get both newly creative minds minted that have zero experience and are willing to try anything, and kind of sometimes look at the same problem we've had and have a unique idea that was staring us in the face and none of us realized, versus sometimes that idea being the most horrific one because operationally it would fail. And there's reasons to go that path. That's kind of the beauty of, I think, what's happening when you have more of a maturing, I should say, not mature profession. With so many people interested, is it brings kind of super smart minds that focus on it out of school that kind of would have had to land in it after bouncing through other things 10 years ago, to now it's a draw of some of the most talented people you've got coming through. That to me is a super exciting kind of thing that's changed along with the whole evolution of the space.
That people are purposefully choosing to aim their career towards privacy as opposed to falling into it blindly through luck. And finding out they have a talent for it, which you really do need to have a talent for privacy. So what would you say and GDPR really brought this out. So I want to make sure that people understand I am relating this to GDPR. What do you say makes a good privacy professional? What traits?
I think one of the most important things is being able to put yourself in other shoes, right? In kind of a very open way. So think about, like, we're all consumers. We can sometimes get hung up because you're working for your business and you're trying to solve your business, team's needs, and they want to use data in this way. Well, can you kind of truly take that hat off and act like you're just Joe on the street coming and interacting with that business, and just think about it like a more like a non-privacy person, like a normal human? So can you get out of your own skin and take different perspectives? Can you try to do that same thing with like a regulatory hat on, right? I think that's a general important trait for anyone in business, whether it's negotiating something with someone else, what have you. Like, can you fit yourself into their shoes and try to figure out what their motivations are? And I think that's incredibly important here, because you have kind of a uniquely different set of constituencies, right? You have the business, you have its customers, you have business partners, and you have regulator view, and all of these things kind of come together to define something. And of course, like, the regulator view in Europe's different than US, and California is different than, Brazil. And that different mindset and kind of what's behind it all is really important. Knowing the law is important, studying those things is important, but it's a unique skill to be able to get out of your own skin and have a different perspective and truly try to do that in a neutral, like, normal person way. It's very hard to do. It's very hard to do.
And it is. And I truly believe the GDPR has really proven that point to a lot of professionals, not just the fact of how many professionals were anticipated to be needed for DPOs, and how the number of registered DPOs far outpaced what had been anticipated, the number of DPOs registered. So I do believe that the GDPR has been, as you said, hugely impactful in a number of ways on companies, on privacy, on country laws, on professionals, everything. So
I think there's
Paul, it looks like there's a question burning for you, Paul.
Yeah, let's take a look at enforcement, because
I was trying to avoid enforcement.
Oh no, enforcement is fun. Sorry, that was my former regulator hat speaking. But enforcement is important, and Chris already mentioned very rightly, in my view, that it is not all about the fines.
Right.
Because the suspension of processing can be much more impactful. But if you look at at the numbers, there has been well over 115 million euro in cases in fines so far. We've seen well over 300,000 enforcement cases just in the first year of the GDPR. So my best guess is that we are at somewhere 800,000 by now since the start of the new legal framework. And still we have lots of people saying, well, GDPR is not being enforced. Why should we take it seriously? And probably that is just because people are still waiting for the massive fines that are expected out of Ireland in, well, maybe the coming days, the coming weeks, for Google, Facebook, Microsoft, and all the other tech companies on investigations that have been ongoing for so many years. Chris, what are your views? Is enforcement that important for GDPR compliance? Will we see companies stepping back from compliance if the law isn't being enforced, or will other peer review options or civil society groups or class actions or things like that also help towards compliance?
Yeah, I think as we talked about earlier, the mindset is shifting a little bit from it, being justified, like we have to get it right for the fines, and now we have to get it right for the brand. And the brand includes fines, obviously. But to me, I think all of those things are coming together to provide motivation for businesses to kind of get things right. And again, whether that is the fines, which I agree with you, I think to me, there's been a lot of talk initially of the European regulators won't enforce. And I look at it and see the data and I'm like, they absolutely have. And it's, a lot of times in that first year in particular, where it's less about the fines, more about awareness and do this and, provide additional guidance. So I think that you will see over time the dollar amount for a lot of those start to ramp, because if people don't continue to pay attention and listen and focus and see what's happening, the price of each of those will go up. I think you also will see some bigger ones, and we'll see when, given the COVID situation we're all in right now and how things have locked down. But to me, I think fines are an important motivator for business, absolutely, especially when they hit your space, right? Or a company that you know, or even like somebody that you know that's at that company, even if it's a totally different industry. Like all of those things trickle back and you hear about them, and that then becomes a part of your criteria and risk calculation. But like I said before, I think what's equally important is people are more focused on kind of how they're perceived. What their brand reputation is. And while it may be harder to justify in hard dollar terms, I think we've had enough breaches over time and seen the impact of breaches that kind of any brand damage along these, you didn't handle my data right lines, irrespective of what or why or what regulator it is, are starting to become much more to the forefront. We saw that happen in security. There were not fines for a very long time, but the breaches got to be big enough, and then the fines became big enough that, it was the risk of brand damage that caused a lot of the security spend over time, and fines really came pretty late in the process, at least the more substantive ones. And so I think all of these things are drivers. And then likewise, I said that peer pressure is one that shouldn't be underestimated, right? Because a lot of the value in this data is in working together and sharing it with others. And whether it's like the California law that actually gives you the consumer the ability to say, don't sell my data, right? Which I think is an interesting twist that might be replicated in a whole host of different ways. But more importantly, just that whole, like, are you compliant with this law? Like, I'm about to buy your product, and before I implement your product, I want you to tell me that you have this solved, right? And you're seeing much more of that type of pressure happening as well. So I think it's a multifaceted reason that just then becomes a part of the DNA of a company. Like, you wouldn't go to a US company right now and say something like, hey, you probably don't worry about Sarbanes-Oxley anymore, right? Like, you just kind of wing it, right? Like, you get to a point over time where it's ingrained and you're focused on the evolution of the law and the guidance and what happens with the technology that underlies it, that allows you to do different things. And it becomes just a part of the fabric of how you operate as a business, whether you're big, whether you're small, whether you're in region X or Y or Z, or industry X or Y or Z. And that's still happening kind of day in and day out. Fines certainly are a driver in that, but there's a whole host of other things that are as well.
Right. And we are coming to the end of our time. Paul, did you have a last question that you wanted to ask Chris, or should we ask Chris if he had something he really wanted to share that we haven't asked him yet?
I think I want to look ahead. Chris, how do you see the future of privacy compliance?
Well, I think Like you'd said, I would agree with the perspective that GDPR as a law will probably not see things other than the kind of consistent flow of additional guidance. And I think that model of giving additional guidance is going to be with us for years and years. And that's because there are still a whole host of things that are specific that aren't quite right yet. And so through guidance, they'll kind of work to amend those things without necessarily cracking that document open. Because as soon as you crack it open, another 5 years will happen before it gets approved. It's big, it's difficult, it's hard, right? And like you mentioned earlier, the number of parties involved from a European Union perspective make California legislature look easy, which is not being in California. Not true. But on a comparative basis, like, wow, right? But I think what, has kind of gone on hold, like we were tracking here in the US a whole host. I think at the peak, it was 19, 20 different state laws and discussions about a federal law here in the US. Obviously, you've seen GDPR motivate things like Brazilian law. You've seen India continue to be debated. You've seen all sorts of countries or in the US states pick this up and have these discussions. And I think a lot of them are driven by elements of the GDPR that are looked at that are thought of as something that we need to replicate in other places with, of course, their own unique twists and tweaks. My guess is that 2020 will be kind of the lost year in terms of any of these regulations happening.
The lost year. I'm going to keep that.
That's understandable, right? Let's just step back and say, like, I haven't left my house to go to the office in 8 weeks. And here in California, we're probably another month out before things start opening in San Francisco. And we've done, I think, a relatively good job of, staying in place and not having high case counts of COVID. But I think that what it also causes is privacy is still incredibly top of mind.
Right.
Like if you think about and step back for a second, the topic in January and February, the beginning of the year, it was all about the election in the US. Who was going to be the Democratic nominee? COVID hit and you saw people drop out of the race and it ended up being Biden. And like when Bernie Sanders stepped out, like it wasn't the biggest news item of the day. It wasn't even close. It was the number of case counts, the number of deaths, what the economy was doing because of the shutdown. And so for this COVID situation to jump to be that prominent and kind of knock that out of the news was surprising. But what it dragged with it was the conversation on privacy, right? Because as people think about what's it take to reopen a business, who can I temperature check? Who can I tell if someone's get sick? How long can I keep this data? When do I destroy it? Do I test every day? Do I just ask questions? Can I actually be, temperature scanning someone's forehead? And how do I do that in state A versus state B versus state C in the US? Are those the same? Are they different? Let alone all these global locations of manufacturing. Like privacy is first and foremost in terms of like, can I open my offices safely? And how do I balance that individual's privacy with kind of get back to work health issues of my entire employee base, right? And so it's interesting to see that while, at least in the US, these state laws have decreased, it's almost like we've become more topical in the health front and jumped above some things that we weren't above before, like who the Democratic nominee is in terms of privacy being an issue in kind of this whole COVID crisis. So I think the issues that we're dealing with, the ways that this evolves, the ways that the regulatory frameworks evolve, whether that's, specific to a certain law, GDPR or otherwise, I think if you're in the privacy space, you have a lot of opportunities because the issues aren't going away. They're only becoming more paramount.
Absolutely.
Excellent. And with that, we conclude another episode of Serious Privacy. If you like our series, please do tell your friends and colleagues about us. And should you have any questions or suggestions, feel free to reach out via seriousprivacy@trustarc.com or via Twitter at @podcastprivacy. You will find Kay on Twitter as Heart of Privacy and myself as EuroPolB. Let us know any questions that you may have, any guests you would like to hear from, or if you would want to be on the program yourself. Thank you again for listening to Serious Privacy, and until our next episode, goodbye.
Bye, y'all.
That was Serious Privacy.
If you're a data protection or privacy professional, you already know the pressure. Non-stop regulatory change, AI oversight, internal demands, and the expectation to somehow stay ahead of it all. And the old patchwork of tools just isn't cutting it anymore.
No, That's why TrustArc created a modern privacy management platform powered by Arc Intelligence. The TrustArc platform brings your workflows, evidence, research, tasks, and applications all together in one unified and intelligent workspace so you don't waste time digging, clicking, or context switching.
With Ask Arc, your privacy assistant, you can ask plain language questions about laws, jurisdictions, or even your own program data and get credible, cited answers based on NIMD research and more than 1,000 global laws. It's explainable, transparent, and purpose-built for data protection and privacy.
So if you need to add a vendor, create a cookie banner, or start an assessment, quick actions take formally complex tasks, turn them into bite-sized guided workflows to save you time.
It's a platform that thinks like you, works like you, and helps you move faster with confidence, whether you're a seasoned DPO or you're just getting started.
See how modern privacy gets done. Explore Arc at trustarc.com/serious-privacy. That's trustarc.com/serious-privacy.